Cool. Okay, so some logistics. This talk is supposed to take about 50 minutes. I was thinking we'd take 2 breaks in between for like a couple minutes to answer questions and just to take a break. And at the end, we'll have more questions. Also, feel free to ask during. This talk assumes just a basic understanding of JavaScript and front-end development. And its aim is to kind of scratch the surface of Angular and give you the tools to learn more about it. Who am I? I'm Jeff Carpenter. I work at Bloodhound. We make a sales lead collecting app for scanning business cards and badges at conferences. And I work on the web dashboard that all your leads go into, which uses Angular, of course. If you want to reach out to me, I'm jcarp on Twitter or hi@jeff.is. And if you want to view this talk afterward, it's at this link, Jeff Carp, or not afterward, during as well, jeffcarp/AngularJS-talk. The style of this talk will be sort of like, we'll write what we want to happen, and then we will implement it in, sort of do the implementation and explain what's happening. I know in the description of this talk, it said we go over testing. In the interest of time, we won't have time for that, but I'm going to include some links that you can go to find out about testing. And there's more links and full-length explanations in the repo. Yeah, obviously, audience participation is encouraged. We can treat this like sort of a pair programming session if you want to. Yeah, so let's get started. Did you hear a cat cafe is coming to San Francisco? And we all know that herding cats is sort of like herding cats. So yeah, let's make a cat cafe management app. So variable names are always better when they're crowdsourced. So let's get some Mad Libs. First, I need a noun. Hornet?
Yeah.
Okay. Adjective? Fast. Percentage? 3%, and then a dollar amount. 807. It's very specific. Okay, cool. All right, let's get started with index.html. I'm going to paste this HTML tag and head in. Here we go. Is that big enough? It's probably not big enough. Let me make this bigger. Yeah, is there a way to make this brighter?
Shut the lights off.
Let's see if I can. Oh, nice, nice. Okay, cool. So this is going to be called the Fast Hornet Cat Cafe. And our regular price is going to be it's not going to be $10. Sorry, it's going to be $807. Kind of an expensive cat cafe. And then today's price is, and here we will have our first Angular expression. Which will consist of the discounted price. So we have a $sign for our price, and then inside, this is our first Angular expression. So in here, we can evaluate anything that's sort of like JavaScript, and it'll interpret it that way. So we'll do our price, 807, times our discount, which is 0.03 for 3%. So let's crack that open in the web browser. Cool. Okay, so this just outputs our HTML. And that's not really what we wanted it to do. We wanted it to interpret that expression. We've included Angular up here. So the first thing we need to do is add ng-app to our body. And this tells Angular everything inside this DOM element, Angular is going to worry about. If you just want to use Angular in like a sidebar in your page, you can put ng-app in that sidebar, and Angular will not touch the DOM outside of that. So Angular is kind of modular that way, and I hope that's visible enough. But if we refresh it, oh, okay. It looks like we need to start the server. So let's do. So I'm going to serve this page with this bash alias command that I've written. Not written, but taken. And it's, if you want to use it, it's this command, python -m simple HTTP server, and then the port number 5000. And that's also in the notes, I believe. Cool. So now that we see our discounted price is being calculated correctly, we've used our first Angular directive, ngapp, and our first Angular expression in these handlebars. Cool. So yeah, obviously hard coding stuff in the template, as we all know, is not great. So let's put our discount into a variable. Yeah.
You have to if you add ngapp to your body, it'll just go through the entire body and do Angular magic to everything inside the curly braces.
Yeah, yeah. Are you asking if it's like recursive, sort of?
Well, I'm asking, if you add ngapp, would I have to, if I didn't put it in body, would I have to put it like in every tag? Like if I didn't put it in the body ngapp, would I have to put it in h3 ngapp? Like I could put it anywhere I wanted, or?
No, you only have to put it on the top element that your Angular app is attached to. Woo. Difficult. Okay. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, let's go on. So we're using this variable. Okay, so let's explain this variable. When we use variables in our Angular template, the way that Angular supplies the data to that template is scope. And we'll talk a lot more about scope, but essentially, anytime you use a variable in a template, like discount, Angular is going to look up whatever scope you're in, and then .discount. So if we're just an ngapp, it's going to be looking up on root scope.discount, whatever that is. So for the purposes of populating this variable, let's define root scope.discount, and that means we're going to have to actually make our Angular app now. So let's do, let's make a new file called app.js, and in here, we're going to define window.app is an Angular module called app. And this empty array here is the dependencies for our module, and we have none, so we can just pass it an empty array. And we'll add this script tag to our index. So now our Angular app is included. And now we have to tell ngapp the name of the global variable that our app is residing in, which is just app. Cool.
There are many apps here, so which app is that referring to?
So I guess this is confusing. For the purposes of our app, we can do like cat cafe here and put it there, and that's so what this is referring to, this ngapp, is referring to this module name here. But usually when I've seen it, they're both the same name. I'm just going to rename these as app. Cool, okay, so our end goal was to assign something to root scope.discount. So let's define this .run function on our Angular app, which is run after the app is instantiated. And we're not going to have this permanently, but this is just to demonstrate assign something to root scope.discount. Cool. If we go back to our page, ooh, oh no. I wonder. Oh, you know what? Okay. True. Thank you. Ooh, okay. So root scope is injected into here, and dependency injection is something we'll get to in a sec. But we inject root scope into here. Discount is an attribute that's defined, and it works.
What is the thing you did in the parameter? Where is root scope coming from?
So this is an Angular, a part of Angular called dependency injection. And it's the way that you deliver required resources into your module. So instead of, say you needed this root scope, and you were doing something like common.js, you could do equals something like root scope. So the way Angular handles dependencies is that you specify them in the parameters of your function. Okay, I cannot type.
And your root scopes is JavaScript.
Yes. Although Angular, yes, it's a JavaScript object. Okay, cool. Sorry?
Do we inspect what root scope is and see
So actually, it's not assigned to the window object, so we can't really like pull it out, but we can do something like console.log root scope. And so it is a JavaScript object, but Angular assigns a lot of other Angular helpers to it. Cool. So let's actually create our own scope now instead of just using a root scope. And we'll do that by defining an actual controller. So to do this, let's create a div, and we'll use this directive called ngController. And what ngController does is, among other things, it assigns a scope that's only visible to inside the controller, and it allows you to package your logic up into the controller. So we'll do something like home. And we'll define the controller here. And we'll pass it a function. This is going to be the controller function. And we'll inject into that function the scope. And because it's not root scope anymore, which is only used by ngApp, all other scopes are just referred to as scope. So we can do scope here dot discount is our discount again. And let's also do the price so that we have no hard-coded stuff in our template. And we'll put all the prices in an Angular expression too. Cool, so if we go back here, it should stay the same. Great. All right, now we have a controller. We've covered the C in MVC, I guess. Let's go on to, okay, so we've assigned values to a scope, and those values are output into the template. We can also define a function on scope, and that function's output will be outputted into the template. So discounted price can be a function. So we can take this logic out of the template. And we'll take this guy and put it in here. And in the template, you don't have to fully qualify your variables with the scope because it's assumed that they're attributes on scope, but in your controller, you do. So we can do something like that. And the output of our function discounted price right there. Something that you'll do really frequently in Angular is you'll have an array on your scope. So I'm just going to paste this in here. And I hope cats is not too trite of a thing to use for tech demos, but cool. And when you're dealing with arrays on your scope, what you're going to want to use in your template is something called ngRepeat, which is sort of like a for each loop in Angular. But what it does is if you do something like cat in cats, it'll repeat as you would expect for each cat in cats, and it'll copy this element for each of those elements. And the variable cat in here will refer to the current cat that it's repeating over. Cool. So I'm going to spruce up the CSS now with some simple styles. I think we can probably break here if you want to, if anybody has any questions, or I'll just copy and paste styles and we'll keep going.
On the repeat part?
Yep.
So the repeated thing is the item, not the surrounding element.
No, it actually is so this probably would be helpful. If we inspect this, the outer element is the one that's repeated here. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay.
What's the deal with injections?
So it's just for your controllers, for your services, for your directives. Most things in Angular you can inject your dependencies in. So if you define a service and you want to inject that service into your controller, all you have to do is define its name as a parameter to your function. And Angular will read that name and inject that into as a parameter.
So you can, a variable resolution will move up the chain of controllers to the outer, the closing app scope.
I'm not sure if I
So let's
understand.
say you have a template in there of a dog, right? And in your home controller, there isn't a dog. So I assume it would then try to look it up in the root scope for something called dog.
I'm actually not sure. We can try that. Yeah, I'm not sure if root scope goes down into lower scopes.
It's a good problem, but
Yeah, it does. It works.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I think scopes are kind of like global.
It's
It's easy to get
It's
at.
probably a good idea, but it does work.
Yeah.
Cool. So scope will go down into lower scopes unless you're in a directive that explicitly isolates its scope, which we'll get to at the end with directives. Cool. Sorry, I didn't even do the styles. Let's do the styles. Well, this class to cat. Actually, this is just cat. We'll add this link, our header. Cool. I'm going to put just stock photo of a cat with every cat, so we can see it. Oh, yeah. Okay, we can see this repeating. Doesn't look like it's picking up the style.css that I defined. Oh, because I named it styles, not style. Here we go. Cool. All the cats next to each other. Oh, you know what? I also needed to put this container ID on here because I defined a bunch of styles on there. Okay, we're all good now. Okay, awesome. One of the tools that you can use, which I've heard is now maybe frowned upon, but still works, is this thing called AngularJS Batarang. I think that's the reference to the Batman Batarang. But what you can do, something awesome you can do is inspect the scope of a current controller. In here, this is our root scope. This is our controller scope, which will see the things we defined. And then each of these scopes is one of the ng repeats that we're using down here, which also define their own scopes. But I guess as we saw before, scopes get inherited into lower scopes. Why is it what? Sorry? Yeah. Oh, so I posted this. I posted this on Reddit yesterday, and somebody said that AngularJS Batarang is not going to work in the upcoming versions of Angular. So it works right now, but according to Reddit, it's not going to. Which is a reliable source, as we all know. Cool. Okay. So we have one page. That's awesome. Let's make another page for ordering drinks. So originally, routing was built into Angular. Now it is not part of Angular. You have to require this other module called Angular Route. And we'll put this right below our Angular tag here. I think Angular is trying to be more modular, and they're trying not to be a giant block of JS that you include. They're trying to, it's supposed to be more like pick and choose, do whatever you want. So we have Angular Route included in here, and because it's an external module, we have to say explicitly that we're including it. So ng-route is the name, and now we'll have access to everything that it provides. The way you set up routes is in the Angular config function, which is run before everything else in your app. And you cannot inject anything into a config function except for things called providers, which we'll see in a sec. This first thing that I'm going to do is setting HTML5 mode to true. If we don't set this, Angular is going to prefix all of our routes with a hash bang. So like orders, something like that. If we set it to true, it'll do it in true HTML5 mode and let you do routes seamlessly. So to define the first route, just the route that we just created, we do route provider.when. And when is a chainable function, and we'll chain it in a second. But right now, we'll just do our first route. The first parameter to this is the route, and the second parameter is an object. And here we'll pass our controller name, home controller. And the URL of the template that we're using. And right now we don't have a home.html, so let's take everything in our home controller here. It's kind of messy right now, and put it into a new file called home.html. We're not going to need this anymore, the home controller. And we're going to put something here called ngView, which comes with Angular route or ngRoute. And ngView, as you might guess, is when you're on this current route, ngView assumes the role of the controller. So it's as if like ngController is attached to it. And anything in this template URL is injected into here. Cool. So if we go back, everything should be in working condition. Cool. So let's define our second route. Cool. We'll define orders in our app.js. So I'm just going to copy this and make the route orders. We'll just have orders controller, and we'll have orders.html. I'm going to make orders.html and just put like a stub h1 in here. And in this same file, let's define orders controller. And we'll pass scope into it again. And we'll just stub that out as well. So now when we go to orders, Angular will pick up orders.html that we defined and the orders controller that we defined right here. I guess the last piece in our initial routes is probably to define a navigation so that we can actually get to where we want to go. Yep. Oh. I created a stub file here that just has the h1 in here. Let's see, orders. I guess we probably shouldn't have this h1 in our home controller. We should probably put it out here. Sorry about that. That's we'll have this h1 on all of our pages. And then let's put a nav here. And we'll have an A that goes to home, which is just the root, and then we'll have our orders, which will go here. In Angular, whenever you are using routes in Angular, and you have an anchor like this, Angular will pick this up, and before it gets to the browser to request a page load, Angular will like load the page within itself, and that's sort of where Angular being a single page app framework comes in. That's also, if you're using ngRoute, you sort of have to go full single page app, because Angular doesn't know when you have these anchors whether that route exists or not. So if we do have like cats or something, but we don't have that defined, Angular will still try to load that route and fail. So there's no fallback built in. You have to sort of hook into that and build it yourself. So we have this this nav. Let's check it out. Oh, it's out here. Let's put it in our container. Cool. There's our orders.html with just the h1 and our homepage. Cool. Let's go to orders. Okay, so we've done the V and the C. Let's do the M in MVC. And I know Angular might not be fully MVC. There might be other letters trying to get into that acronym, but for the sake of simplicity, I just consider it MVC. So let's do M. We'll do, instead of like what we did, close this. Instead of doing this scope.cats, let's actually put it into a model where the data belongs for orders. So let's do .factory, which is one way of defining a model. It'll be called orders. And we're not going to inject anything into this model, but if your model is communicating with your server, you're going to want to inject something like HTTP into it, which is Angular's utility for communicating over HTTP. So in here, in a factory, what you do is this outer function defines an object, which acts as the object that's going to become your model, and you just have to return that object. And whatever you do in here, you can add functions or methods and configure your model. So we'll do orders.add, or actually first, let's set up our internal state. So orders is just an empty array. Well, actually, let's add an order in there so we see something when we put it in the template. So we'll make orders.add a function that takes an order. And this will just do orders.push order. And we'll do another method, orders.all, which we're about to use. And that'll just return all of our orders. Cool. So we've defined our model. Let's inject it into our controller. So we've defined the orders model is being named that. We can use that name up in our orders controller and inject that model in. So we can do something like that. And Angular will pick that up and inject whatever object we define down here into our controller. Sorry? Oh, what is?
A factory.
Oh, a factory. Okay, so a factory is a way of creating models. And I'm guessing it's sort of like the factory pattern where you have this function in the outer, you pass it this function sets up an object that's returned. And the object that's returned here is the model that you can inject. Hopefully that's a better explanation. Yes, it's treated as, when you're using models in Angular, they are singletons. So if you inject it into a controller and you have another controller and one changes something, it'll be reflected in that other controller immediately. Okay, so in our orders controller, let's have scope.orders. And we'll use orders.all to return all of our orders. And then we'll open orders.html and just do the same thing that we did with the ng repeat before. And just output that order here. So since we already started with latte in our orders, it should show up on our orders page. Ooh, okay.
What kind of stuff do you put in? Like what other do you put in any other kind of search parameter in there?
To which?
Like the first order or
To all?
well, so like an ng repeat, sorry,
Mm.
is that a powerful thing you can do there? Or is that something you can do?
So for energy repeat,
When can you access the iteration count?
Yeah. I mean, well, is that the question then?
Is it,
For Alex's question, you can access the iteration count with index.
what is index?
Index is a variable that's available to you inside an ng repeat. It'll just be the index.
So like
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. But I don't know if that answers your question. That's,
I'm wondering, like, could I get like the third order if I wanted to?
I guess then would you need an ng repeat for that? Couldn't you just do something like orders 3, something like that, or 2 if you're
Maybe the question is, can you do order in order square, order less than 5, or order so to use it in a more powerful way, right?
Yeah. What you can do with ng repeats is that if you want to modify the array before it's passed into this ng repeat, you can use a filter, which we'll get to in a bit. But essentially, filters are kind of like a modifier for your directives. So what you can do is like you can define a filter that's like third, and that'll be a function that takes in an array and outputs the third element. Or you could do something like reverse, which will just output them but reversed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. I don't think reverse is built in. Cool. So we did orders.all. We did our ng repeat. Let's dive into two-way data binding and using form elements.
Can you back up a moment there with the orders?
Which orders?
That's the problem. In the orders controller,
Yeah.
the second parameter is a capital order. Orders.
Oh, this.
Yeah.
Let me just close this. Okay, so this order is right here.
Right. So did that have to match the factory?
It has to match the factory name, or else Angular won't know what to inject.
It's kind of weird because the way I look at it is like that's just an argument name. You could call it foobar, and as long as you say foobar, not all, fine. Right?
You can. The way Angular does dependency injection is sort of magical. What it'll do is it'll take this function you pass it and run toString on it and try to parse out the argument names.
Gotcha.
If you want to use a different name for your parameter, you can pass an array to any of these functions and then define the actual names like scope, orders, and then you can use literally anything here. And the order will be maintained.
So that has to match the factory essentially. Unless I want to go dance around it.
Yeah. These strings have to match the factory.
What about minification?
Yes, this is useful for minification. If you want to use, there's a utility called ngmin, which will automatically do this if you're minifying your code. But if you can't use ngmin in your tool chain, you're going to have to define your controllers like this in this array style. Sorry, not controllers. You're going to have to define everything that uses dependency injection with this array style. Require it. Like that. So this is, you can do this if you're using a utility called browserify. This utility, though, isn't built into the browser. So this is just Angular's way of getting around. Dependency injection is Angular's sort of module system. There are others like browserify that allows you to use require. And at Bloodhound, we actually use both, just because that's the way it worked out. So let's go back to what we had before. Okay, cool. Let's do two-way binding. Okay, so usually to add something, the general goal here for this segment is we're going to add something into our orders using .add. So to start out, we're going to have this new order, which is just going to be a string. In our template, the orders.html, we're going to define this input. And we're going to use this utility called ngModel, or director called ngModel. And in ngModel, you place a variable that's on your scope, like new order. And like one-way binding, anything in this controller, this empty string now, will be reflected in the template. But because we're using ngModel, which allows you to do two-way binding, any change in the template will go back and change the controller. So if I put, like, if you type something in this input, it'll be reflected in here. So let's test that out with the AngularJS battering. Oh, it had to reload itself. Okay, so this is our controller scope here. We see the order is latte and the new order is blank. If we start typing in here, it'll be reflected on this scope object, the one we defined up here. So I guess the next thing that we need to do is have a button that calls a function on our scope to let it know that we're ready to put that string that we've populated into the orders model. So we'll have a button, and we'll use ngClick, which does what it says it does. And you pass a function to ngClick or an expression, and when it's clicked, it'll evaluate that. So we'll do place order as our function, which is referring to something on our scope, which we'll define scope.placeOrder. Cool. And what placeOrder is going to do is it's going to call the model function add, and then it's going to reset new order back to a blank object. So let's just copy that in, and then we'll call, or first we'll call orders.add, and we'll pass it new order. I'll space this out a little bit. So we have ngClick is place order, and place order is here. So let's try that out. Oh, you know what? Need to have some text. Okay. Let's give that another go. Orders. So it's here, and then our controller function puts it in this orders object, and then deletes or resets new order. So we'll watch that happen while we're inspecting the scope. Cool. Awesome. So I'm going to add this to our styles.css so that the input spans the entire width, so it looks nicer. And then we're going to turn this form into a real form, so we get a couple more utilities, which I'll talk about in a sec. So let's put all this into a form tag. And we'll turn this button into a real submit button. We want this whole ngClick. Actually, sorry, we don't even need ngClick now. Okay, so our submit button is going to say place order, and we don't have to put a click handler on that anymore because we can put a directive on form called And this allows us to, if we have a submit button, when it's clicked, it'll submit the form. And also, if you're focused on a form element, if you press enter, it'll also submit the form then. So it gives us that too. And another thing that you can do when these are in a real form is you can use Angular's built-in validation methods. So you can do something like ng min length is 3 because we don't want any short orders here. And then this will be reflected on a scope variable that we'll define. We'll have this named the form, and when you add a name to a form element, what Angular does is it picks that up. Let's do like order form. It'll pick this up and it'll assign it to our current scope. So the current controller scope will have scope.order form right there waiting for us, and that'll be an instance of that, or it'll allow us to access this form and whether it's valid or not. So if we open up our app.js, before we actually add the order, we can do something like if scope.order form, this name that we define here, dot valid, which is something that is on form objects in Angular. There's also invalid, which is just the reverse if you like to be contrarian. We can return an alert or something like something like that. Cool. So if you have like a 2-word order, oops, didn't work.
You want to be invalid.
Oh, yes, thank you. There we go. Okay. Cool. So there we go. And there are a bunch of other form validation directives that you can put on inputs and form elements that all link up to form.valid, form.invalid. Now let's get into filters. Before we saw that you can assign something like a reverse filter on here. Filters, a lot of the times I've seen, are used for string manipulation. So let's say we have our home.html. We have price here, but because it's a price, we always have to remember to add this $sign. And there's a chance that it could round to a lot more decimal places than prices usually are. So this is a good example of where you might want to put in a filter. And we could put something like US dollars here and define a filter that automatically parses US dollars and outputs them in the right format. So in app.js, we can do .filter, and the same name that we used in the template. And to filter, you pass an outer function which returns an inner function, and this inner function is what this string is run through. So it takes a string and it outputs a string.
What is the outer function? What do you have the outer function for?
The outer function is so that you can set it up. If you just had it like this, you wouldn't, like, for example, I'm not sure if I can think of an example.
So it's like a factory. The first one's run once.
Yeah,
The
this.
return function is run every time it needs to filter.
Yeah, this is, as you said, it's sort of like the factory model where this outer function returns the function that you want to use. So for instance, if the filter differed based on what the window.location is, then you could return a different filter. Something like that. You could return a different filter based on what the conditions are when it's being set up. So for this, we'll just do what we said in prefix with a $, and then we'll coerce this to a number so that we can run toFixed. And this just rounds the number to two decimal places. So if we go back and check out home, we'll see that that does what we wanted it to do. Cool. So yeah, I guess backends come in all shapes and sizes. In the interest of time, usually I guess you would use the HTTP utility to connect to your backend. If you're using Firebase or you don't have much time left in your talk, you can use this utility called Firebase as your backend. You can include these two scripts, one of which is just the regular Firebase client, and the other is called AngularFire, which is an adapter that you can inject into your app. So yeah, to enable a backend / real-time communication, we can put this in here, add it to our app's dependencies. So we now have, it's getting kind of crowded here, Firebase here. We can define a value, which is sort of, it's what it says it's a value, but it allows, it's sort of like it's like a primitive model. You can define this value here and then inject it into any injectable area like that. And the injected object will just be that value. And then what we can do is we can replace our entire orders factory because AngularFire supplies us with all these methods now, and just return, we can delete this, and we can just return this newly instantiated Firebase object, which will take care of all of our CRUD operations for us. Cool. And then to get that to work with our controller, instead of doing orders.all, we just do orders, because it now will just return the array of orders. And instead of orders.add, we have to prefix it with a $, because that's how AngularFire does things.
What is AngularFire?
AngularFire is, you've heard of Firebase? It's an adapter that sort of shims Firebase into the way Angular treats models. So it allows you to sort of inject models and use them as if they're, inject Firebase models as if they're regular models. Cool. So the add function takes, because this is now an asynchronous call, it takes a callback and will null out our new order only after the callback comes back. Cool. So now that we have that in place, let's go check this out. We have more scripts now, and we can do something like, oh no. Oh, thank you. Oh, up here. Oh, into the factory. Okay, cool. Thank you. Oh. Oh, yes. Thanks again. Maybe you should be doing this talk.
Well, he is talking about this injection.
Okay, let's go to orders and then latte. Cool. Oh, but it's not nulling that out. this is something that I was very perplexed by when I started with Angular, and that is not well described, is that when you're dealing with callbacks, any method that's called on scope will trigger a redraw or a re-render of the template. When you're dealing with callbacks, this goes out of Angular's view, and Angular doesn't know when the callback comes back, and so it doesn't know when to re-render the template. So we have to manually re-render by calling scope.digest. And that will, the scope did change, but the template did not, because Angular didn't know to do a digest loop. So we can do something like mocha, and it'll do the digest loop after that. And to demonstrate AngularFire, if you also want to access this page and do the same thing, you can go to this URL, and if one person goes to it and adds an order, we should be able to see it pop up here, if it actually does show up. Okay, cool. I'm just going to scroll a little bit down. Oops. Cool. Nice. So that's what AngularFire provides for you.
Oh yeah, now you're talking.
It's a little PG-13 here. Cool. The last thing I was going to cover is directives. We've been using a ton of directives, and the real power of Angular comes out when you can define your own directives.
So like ng repeat.
Yeah, ng repeat is a directive. What the power of Angular is that it's sort of defining this superset of HTML using elements, attributes, class names, and comments that you can use for functionality that's greater than just like basic HTML5. For instance, like if we really wanted a lot of people to come to this cat cafe, the Fast Hornet Cat Cafe, we might think about using the blink tag to make this more prominent, our discounted price. But once we realized that the blink tag was taken out of browsers, with Angular, we would be able to re-implement it ourselves. So let's do that. We'll go back to app.js, and we'll just do .directive. And I hope the way I'm defining these isn't like overly confusing. You can define things in Angular by just chaining it onto this module command. But if we wanted to do it line by line, so it's a little bit easier to like copy and paste, we can just do app.config and app.value and everything like that. Hopefully this isn't overly confusing. Okay, well, now hopefully it's a little bit less confusing. So in directives, if we really wanted to, we can inject like our orders in here, anything that we could inject before. But since blink is pretty simple, we don't really need to do that. And a lot like the other stuff that we did, this outer function is just a setup function that's called once, and it returns our directive, which is just an object of configurations. So let's go through these configurations. Directives can come in many shapes and forms. A lot of the ones that we've seen are like, let's go to like home. ng repeat, which is a directive that comes as an attribute. Directives can also just be elements like this. They can be in classes, like that. And they can also be in comments, but classes and comments are not a very common way of using directives.
But they always have ng. is that?
The built-in directives are prefixed with ng. I think in the docs it says that you should prefix it with something so that it doesn't conflict with other people's directives or with HTML stuff, because it is a global namespace. So in here we'll just restrict this. You can restrict directives to only be used in certain ways, and by passing restrict with the string e in it, that means it can only be used as an element, as the true blink tag should. Okay, let's do, next one is transclude. And this is where Angular likes to get a little academic in its terminology. But transclude is essentially, it means if we're, let's put this here, our end goal is to have something like blink and put something inside it. Transclude essentially means it'll take anything that was originally, any children that were originally inside this directive, and output them in the final directive's children. So it'll just take whatever's there, whatever scope it has, and then output it afterwards. Like say our blink added another span in here, it would add a span, but preserve all the children, which is what transclude does. And that's what we'll use, because we want the stuff that we originally passed into blink to be blinking. So transclude true. And then the next thing we need is our link function, which is called when Angular sets up the directive. And this is past the scope object, the actual element, and the attributes. We won't use these parameters though. And then, well, I guess first we need to set up our scope variable. We'll just call it visible, and this will be the data. This will control whether our directive is visible or not. And then we'll use a set interval call. And say like every second, we will just set scope.visible to false, or negate it. And because this is a callback function, and Angular doesn't know when it returns, we have to manually call scope.digest. This actually is this was the original way that I was introduced to this, but Angular has a utility called interval, which wraps set interval and calls scope.digest at the end. So we can just use that. Okay. Yeah, it'll take all the current state of the controller and then render the HTML with that.
Is this smart enough to render once, or it re-renders as many times digest is called? Is that what he meant?
I believe, well, for every time you call digest.
Yeah.
I believe that will only render it once. Angular has a way, or at least its sort of secret sauce is that it does this checking of your scope variables, and when they change, it'll call digest automatically. But stuff like a callback function will not trigger that digest. Cool, and then the last thing we need is the template of our blink tag, which will just be this ng transclude. Just tells it take any children that were originally inside it and put it inside the current element that ng transclude is on. And this ng show takes a scope variable, which we defined as visible, and it'll show if that evaluates to true. Cool. So let's do that. Oh no, it's not blinking. Oh, because we haven't actually put it in the template. So let's put it in the template. All right, so this is a steal, so we really want to emphasize this with a blink tag. There we go. Cool. Cool. And that's about as much time as I think we have. That should be enough to sort of scratch the surface with Angular, and if you're interested in it, you can refer to this or many other awesome tutorials to learn more. Just to wrap up, what do I have to go over? Oh, Bloodhound is looking for an iOS engineer, so if you know any, let me know, or you have my contact info. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.